History books are filled with the names of kings and generals, but the real power behind the throne was often found in a harbor. For centuries, the secret rulers of Europe were not in palaces, but in ports. These bustling waterfront cities operated as hidden political engines, quietly steering the fate of nations. This journey will show you the invisible mechanics of power that textbooks often miss. How did a city built on water command empires? Why did bankers in a single port hold kings in financial chains? We will uncover how control over a dock, a warehouse, or a shipping lane could decide the outcome of a war or the rise of a dynasty. By the end, you will see the map of history redrawn, with trade routes as the true borders of influence. What forgotten force do you think still quietly shapes our world today? This power was not simply about counting coins. To understand how a port became a political actor, we must dissect its anatomy. The influence of these cities came from a perfect, and often deliberate, convergence of four essential elements. First, geography was destiny. A port needed a deep, sheltered harbor, yes, but its true power came from controlling a bottleneck. Think of a narrow strait through which all east-west trade must pass, or a river mouth that served as the only sea gate for a vast inland kingdom. Whoever held that choke point held a knife to the throat of continental commerce. Second, they needed a monopoly or near monopoly over something the world desperately. Rarely about bulk goods like grain. True leverage came from luxuries that defined status and power. Spices from distant islands, silk for royal courts, alum for fixing dyes to fabric, or later, silver from the New World. Controlling the sole supply of pepper could make a monarch negotiate. Third, and this is crucial, the port had to master both the sea and the ledger. It required a navy or hired fleets to protect its convoys and enforce its will on the waves. But just as important was the financial network, a web of credit, insurance, and banking that allowed money to move faster than any ship. A king could borrow from a port's bankers to fund his war, and in doing so he handed them a leash. Finally, the social fabric of the port itself was its secret weapon. These cities were populated by transnational merchant elites. A family might have one brother in Alexandria buying spices, another in Bruges selling cloth, and a cousin in London financing voyages. Their loyalty was not to a crown, but to the network and the profit it generated. This borderless, fluid identity allowed them to negotiate with kings as equals, playing nations against each other with a detachment no traditional noble could manage. It was only when all these strands, the strategic location, the coveted goods, the martial and financial tools, and the cosmopolitan merchant class, wove together that a port ceased to be just a marketplace and began to quietly govern the affairs of continents. No other city embodies this hidden power structure more completely than Venice. It was not merely a city with a port, it was a port that had become a city, a sovereign republic whose every stone and law was shaped by the sea. Built upon wooden piles driven into a lagoon, its survival was an act of defiance against nature, a declaration that its destiny lay not on solid land, but upon the shifting waters of commerce. The Adriatic Sea was not its border, but its private highway, and the intricate trade routes stretching to Constantinople, Alexandria, and the ports of the Levant were its lifelines. Venice positioned itself as the indispensable middleman, the sole reliable conduit through which the silks, spices, and luxuries of the East flowed into the hungry markets of Europe. To control that flow was to hold a gentle but unbreakable influence over kings and popes who depended on these goods for their prestige and power. This commercial reality was etched directly into its government. Unlike the feudal monarchies of Europe, Venice was a merchant republic. Its leader, the Doge, was often chosen from among the wealthiest trading families, and the entire political structure of the Great Council and the Senate was designed with one primary objective: to protect and advance Venetian commercial interests. State policy was trade policy. A decision to build a new fleet, to sign a treaty, or even to go to war was first and foremost a calculation about securing a harbor, breaking a rival's monopoly, or safeguarding a shipping lane. The famed Venetian diplomacy was not an art of princely courtship, but a precise tool for business negotiation on a global scale. Its ambassadors were, in effect, the world's most powerful corporate spies and dealmakers, sending home detailed reports on markets, politics, and opportunities. In Venice, the ledger and the lawbook were one and the same, creating a form of sovereignty where profit was the highest form of patriotism, and the port itself was the throne room. But commercial genius alone could not protect a fortune floating on the sea. Venice's true trump card, the physical engine that translated its economic might into political reality, was a place known simply as the Arsenal. This was not merely a shipyard, it was a state-controlled industrial marvel on a scale Europe would not see again for centuries. Enclosed behind high walls, it functioned like a single, living machine dedicated to one purpose: the systematic creation of maritime power. At its peak, the arsenal employed thousands of specialized workers, carpenters, caulkers, rope makers, foundry workers, all operating in a coordinated assembly line process decades before the concept had a name. Raw materials flowed in one gate, and fully equipped warships, the dreaded Venetian galleys, sailed out another. The facility's most famous demonstration of efficiency was its ability to produce a complete, sea-ready vessel in the span of a single day, a feat that stunned visiting dignitaries and cemented its legendary status. This capability transformed naval strength from a static asset into a dynamic, on-demand tool of statecraft. For Venice, a fleet was not just for defense or conquest, it was a form of high-stakes diplomacy. The knowledge that the Republic could rapidly summon or replace warships gave it immense leverage in the tangled politics of Europe and the Mediterranean. When a pope or an emperor needed naval support for a campaign, they did not just ask for Venetian ships, they negotiated with Venetian interests. The Republic could promise to unleash a fleet to tip the balance of a conflict, or it could subtly withhold that support to pressure an ally or deter an enemy. This meant that the rumble of hammers within the arsenal's walls was not just the sound of industry, it was the quiet, constant pulse of geopolitical influence. Control over the means of maritime production allowed Venice to project power without always having to use it, making the threat of its navy as potent as its deployment. The shipyard, therefore, was the ultimate guarantor of all those carefully negotiated trade deals and financial agreements, the iron fist inside the velvet glove of merchant diplomacy. It ensured that when a rival kingdom looked at a map and considered challenging Venetian dominance, they weren't just looking at a rich trading post, they were looking at a fortress that could rebuild its own defenses faster than they could be torn down. Yet for all its industrial might, Venice did not rule the waves alone. Its greatest rival emerged from another set of jagged cliffs overlooking the Mediterranean, a city that perfected a different, and perhaps even more potent form of port power. While Venice built an empire of islands and trade posts, Genoa built an empire of credit. Its weapon was not the assembly line galley, but the double-entry ledger. The Genoese became the bankers to kings, the quiet financiers whose gold flowed into the treasuries of empires, granting them a shadow sovereignty that stretched from the palaces of Madrid to the silver mines of the New World. The story of Genoa is the story of how money, concentrated in the right port, could bend the course of global history without firing a single cannon. The engine of this financial empire was not a state institution, but a collection of powerful family dynasties with names like Doria, Spinola, and Grimaldi. These were not just merchants, they were financial architects, over generations they spun a web of partnerships and branches that stretched across Europe. A Genoese banker in Seville could provide a letter of credit that would be honored by his cousin in Antwerp or his agent in Constantinople. This network created a system of trust and liquidity that moved vast sums of money across continents faster than any ship could sail. It was the early modern equivalent of a global financial market, and its nerve center was the port of Genoa. Here, in counting houses overlooking the harbor, decisions were made that would fund wars, launch expeditions, and crown kings. This power became absolute when Genoa found its ultimate client, the Spanish crown. As Spain embarked on its colossal projects, the conquest of the Americas and its endless wars against France, the Ottomans, and rebellious provinces, it faced a constant problem. The silver fleets from Potosi were staggeringly rich, but they were slow and unpredictable. The crown's ambitions were immediate and insatiably expensive. The Genoese bankers provided the solution. They offered massive, short-term loans known as asientos to bridge the gap between the crown's pressing needs and the arrival of its New World treasure. In return, they demanded high interest and, crucially, the right to collect the future silver shipments directly. This created a breathtaking cycle of dependency. Spanish power, which appeared invincible on the world stage, was functionally bankrupt, perpetually in debt to a consortium of Genoese families. The bankers did not just lend money, they managed the entire financial pipeline of the Spanish Empire, deciding which armies got paid and which fleets got built. The implications of this were profound. From their offices in Genoa, these bankers exercised a form of remote control over global policy. When a Spanish king contemplated a new military campaign, his advisors had to first consult with his Genoese creditors to see if it could be financed. The priorities of the bank, security for their loans, stability in trade routes quietly shaped the strategies of the world's most powerful monarchy. They effectively bankrolled the age of exploration, not for glory or conquest, but for the steady return on investment. In this light, the galleons crossing the Atlantic were not just vessels of empire, they were floating lines of credit, their precious cargo already promised to the financiers waiting in an Italian port. Genoa demonstrated that the highest form of port power was not necessarily controlling the ship, but owning its debt, proving that the most durable chains holding a king were not forged from iron, but inscribed in interest payments on a balance sheet. While Venice and Genoa centralized power in single city-states, an entirely different model of port sovereignty was taking shape in the cold, gray waters of the north. Here, no single crown or cathedral spire claimed dominance. Instead, power was distributed across a web of independent cities, bound together not by a flag but by a shared ledger. This was the Hanseatic League, a mercantile confederation so formidable it operated as a sovereign empire without an emperor, a kingdom whose territory was not land but trade routes. From London in the west to Novgorod in the east, over 70 cities including giants like Lübeck, Hamburg, and Danzig formed a cooperative network that rewrote the rules of medieval politics. Their strength lay in their unity. A merchant from Cologne enjoyed the same legal protections and trading privileges in the port of Riga as a local, backed by the collective might of the entire league. This created a seamless commercial zone, a common market centuries before the term existed, where goods, credit, and information flowed with a freedom unknown in the fractured feudal kingdoms around them. The League's authority was codified in its own maritime law and enforced by its own shared fleet. When a king, say, of England or Denmark, threatened the privileges of Hanseatic merchants perhaps by raising taxes or seizing goods, the League did not petition or plead. It acted as one. It could impose a total trade embargo, a medieval economic sanction that could cripple a kingdom's supply of essential goods like salt, fish, timber, and the vital Baltic grain that fed growing cities. These were not empty threats. The League fought wars to protect its commercial rights, defeating the Kingdom of Denmark on several occasions to force the reopening of the Sound, the critical strait controlling access to the Baltic. In doing so, they demonstrated that their network, a loose alliance of port mayors and merchant councils, could outmaneuver and outlast traditional monarchies. The Hanse's capital was not a palace, but the annual Hanseatic, the diet where representatives from the member cities met to negotiate common policy. Its borders were not marked by walls or rivers, but by the wharves of its contours, its fortified trading posts in foreign lands like the London Steelyard or the Peterhof in Novgorod. These outposts were extraterritorial enclaves, little islands of Hanseatic law operating inside other realms, where the League's rules superseded those of the host kingdom. This was the ultimate expression of port power, a political entity that existed solely for commerce, capable of diplomacy, warfare, and legislation, yet anchored to no single plot of earth. It proved that sovereignty could be a networked condition, a shared project among harbors, making the map of Northern Europe for centuries a patchwork where the will of merchant guilds often held more weight than the decrees of distant kings. While the Hanseatic League enforced its will with embargoes and fleets, the true lifeblood of its power required a quieter, more cerebral kind of port. That port was Bruges. By the 14th century, this Flemish city, connected to the sea by a silted canal, had become something far greater than a marketplace. It was the clearinghouse of Northern Europe, a place where goods were secondary to the flow of capital and intelligence. Here, the physical might of the Hansa met the financial sophistication of Italy, creating a hybrid engine of influence that pulsed with information and credit. Bruges did not command armies, but it commanded trust, and in the medieval world, that was the ultimate currency. At the heart of this system was the Bourse, a square where merchants from every corner of the continent gathered. Its name, meaning purse, was perfectly apt. This was not a chaotic market stall, but the world's first true international financial exchange. Under its open sky, deals were struck that would determine the price of English wool in Florence or the availability of Baltic grain in Lisbon. But the real magic happened in the counting houses that ringed the square. Here, merchants developed and traded sophisticated credit instruments like the bill of exchange. This was a revolutionary piece of paper. It allowed a merchant in Venice to pay a supplier in Bruges without risking a single coin to bandits or shipwrecks. He would deposit money with a banker in Venice who would issue a bill payable by his correspondent banker in Bruges. This created a secure, efficient web of moving value across borders, separating money from metal and making capital fluid. The concentration of this financial activity made Bruges the indispensable nerve center. A Hanseatic merchant from Lübeck, an Italian banker from Genoa, and an English wool exporter would all find themselves in the same taverns and guild halls, sharing news as they shared wine. The gossip overheard on the Bruges quayside about a poor herring catch in Scandinavia could affect loan terms in Milan. A rumor of political unrest in England, carried by a wool ship captain, could cause financiers to adjust their risk across the continent. This constant, swirling vortex of commercial intelligence meant that the most accurate picture of European stability was not in a king's court, but in the ledgers and conversations of Bruges. Kings and dukes knew this. They stationed their own financial agents in the city, not just to secure loans, but to tap into this information network. A decision to raise taxes, go to war, or form a marriage alliance would be influenced by reports from Bruges on credit availability and merchant sentiment. In this way, the city functioned as a passive yet incredibly powerful political censor. It felt the tremors of change long before they reached the throne rooms, and the flow of its capital could either steady a reeling kingdom or hasten its crisis. Bruges proved that the most critical port might be the one that traded not in spices, but in secrets and promises, where the true commodity was foresight itself. Yet the very information that made Bruges powerful also sealed its fate. Kings who learned to read the financial currents in that city soon realized they could build a port of their own, one designed not by merchants for profit, but by a crown for control. This deliberate act of sovereign engineering created the 16th century's ultimate financial weapon, Antwerp. Its rise was no accident of geography, but a calculated masterstroke by the Habsburg dynasty, who understood that to fund a global empire, they needed to command the pump house of European capital. While Bruges languished as its canal silted up, Antwerp offered a deep, accessible harbor on the Scheldt River, capable of receiving the new, larger ocean-going vessels that were beginning to connect the world. But its real innovation was policy. The city's rulers declared it a free market, abolishing the restrictive guild privileges and medieval tolls that choked trade elsewhere. Merchants of any nation or faith could come, trade openly, and settle disputes in a special commercial court designed for speed and fairness. This open-door policy acted like a magnet, pulling the entire commercial universe of Northern Europe into its orbit. Within decades, Antwerp was not just a market, it was the marketplace. Its annual trade fairs evolved into a permanent, roaring exchange where the wealth of continents converged. Portuguese carracks unloaded spices from the Indian Ocean, Spanish galleons discharged silver from the mines of Potosi, English clothiers sold their woolens, and German bankers offered credit, all within a few city blocks. This concentration of physical and financial goods made Antwerp the indispensable engine of the Habsburg world. Emperor Charles V, whose domains stretched from Spain to Germany to the Netherlands and across the Atlantic, relied on Antwerp as his financial central nervous system. When he needed to pay his vast armies of mercenaries or fund a new campaign against France or the Ottoman Empire, he did not call on scattered treasuries. He turned to the money markets of Antwerp, where his agents could raise colossal loans almost overnight by issuing bonds, known as rents, to the international banking community gathered there. The city's exchange became a giant public clearinghouse for imperial debt. Controlling Antwerp, therefore, meant controlling the purse strings of the most powerful man in Europe. This made the port the ultimate prize in the era's relentless conflicts. Rival kings understood that to cripple Charles V, they did not necessarily need to defeat his armies in the field. They could strike at his financial heart. The city's wealth made it a beacon for ambition and a target for siege. Its fate became the central question in the long struggle for the Netherlands, a conflict where the real objective was never just territory, but the financial engine that made that territory worth fighting for. The story of Antwerp is the clearest proof that in the new age of global empires, the most critical battlefield was often a counting house on a waterfront, where the flow of silver and credit decided the fate of nations. While Antwerp's wealth was measured in silver ledgers, another empire was being built with a far more direct and brutal kind of port power. The Portuguese, a small kingdom on Europe's western edge, could never compete with the financial networks of Italy or the naval might of Venice in the Mediterranean. So they made a breathtaking decision: they would go around everyone. Their weapon was not a grand city, but a new kind of port entirely, the Feitorias. This was not a settlement for families or a center of culture. It was a pure instrument of control, a fortified trading post designed for one ruthless purpose: to seize the spice trade at its source. The Portuguese strategy was surgical. Instead of trying to conquer vast territories, they identified the critical choke points along the maritime spice route from Asia to Europe. They sailed their sturdy carracks around Africa, past the Cape of Good Hope, and into the Indian Ocean, a world of ancient trade networks. There, they planted their Feitorias like iron stakes driven into the map. At Goa on India's west coast, they took command of the Arabian Sea. At Malacca, the narrow strait between Malaysia and Sumatra, they seized the funnel through which all trade between the Indian Ocean and the Spice Islands of the East had to pass. At Hormuz, at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, they controlled the gateway to the Middle East. Each of these forts was a self-contained engine of monopoly. Inside its walls were warehouses, a church, barracks for soldiers, and the administrator's house. Its cannons pointed not inland but out to sea, commanding the harbor entrance. The message was simple and stark. Any spice-laden ship wishing to pass through these waters must now pay a toll to Portugal or face destruction. The Portuguese did not want to govern populations or change local cultures. They wanted to insert themselves as the sole, unavoidable middleman in a trade that had flowed freely for 1,000 years. They enforced this with a system of cartazes, official passes that every merchant vessel was required to purchase. A ship caught without one was confiscated, its cargo stolen, its crew often lost. This network of strategic chokeholds allowed tiny Portugal to perform an economic miracle. For nearly a century, they held a near-total monopoly on the flow of pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg into Europe. The price of spices in Lisbon was a fraction of what they could charge in Antwerp, creating staggering profits that transformed the kingdom overnight. This economic windfall gave Portugal influence in European politics far beyond its size or population. Kings and emperors who once ignored the remote Iberian kingdom now had to court its favor to ensure their own supplies of these essential luxuries. The Portuguese crown used this wealth to fund further exploration, artistic patronage, and monumental building, announcing its arrival as a major power. The Feitorias model proved that in the age of global sail, sovereignty could be portable. You did not need to own a continent, you just needed to own the doors. By locking the most important doors along the world's greatest trade highway, a small nation with a handful of cannon and a relentless will could hold the scent of the East hostage, and in doing so, command the attention of the West. But Portugal's cannons were not the only way to tax a continent. Far to the north, in the cold, narrow strait between Denmark and Sweden, a kingdom perfected a form of port power so simple, so elegant, it required almost no ships at all. The Øresund Strait was the single, slender gateway connecting the Baltic Sea to the North Sea and the wider Atlantic world. Every piece of timber from Scandinavia, every barrel of grain from Poland, every bundle of fur from Russia that was bound for the markets of Amsterdam, London, or beyond had to squeeze through this watery keyhole. The Danish crown, which controlled both shores, realized it did not need to own the cargo or even the ships. It only needed to own the door. In 1529, they made it official with the sound toll. Every single vessel passing through the strait was required to stop at the fortress of Kronborg, looming over the channel like a stone sentinel, and pay a duty based on the value and type of its cargo. This was not a pirate's ransom, but a systematic, state-run tax. The genius of the toll was its inevitability. A merchant could choose to avoid Genoa's bankers or outrun Portuguese patrols, but geography offered no alternative to the sound. To sail around Denmark meant a perilous, weeks-long journey through stormy Arctic waters, a risk no captain with a perishable cargo would willingly take. So they lined up, lowered their sails, and paid. The wealth this generated was staggering in its consistency. For over 4 centuries, the toll flowed into the Danish treasury like a metronome of gold, providing a steady, predictable income that freed the crown from the constant parliamentary haggling over taxes that plagued other European monarchs. This financial independence was political power. It allowed Danish kings to build a formidable navy to enforce the toll, patronize the arts, and fund ambitious projects without begging their nobles for funds. But the toll's true influence was not just in the coins it collected, but in the information it harvested. At Kronborg, Danish officials meticulously recorded every ship, its name, its home port, its captain, and a detailed inventory of its hold. This created the most comprehensive economic dataset in Northern Europe, a real-time ledger of Baltic commerce. The Danish crown knew before anyone else if the Polish grain harvest had failed, if the demand for Swedish copper was spiking, or if a new trade route was emerging. This intelligence made them indispensable brokers and informed strategists in the endless political games of the region. The toll transformed Denmark from a mid-sized Scandinavian kingdom into the gatekeeper of an entire economic zone, a silent partner in every transaction that passed through its waters. For any power, be it the Dutch Republic or the Swedish Empire, that sought dominance in the Baltic, the first and most enduring challenge was not an army but a toll booth. It was a masterclass in passive control, proving that sometimes the most powerful port is not where goods are traded, but where they are simply counted and taxed on their way to everywhere else. But a toll booth, for all its power, could only tax the flow of goods. There was one port whose very existence dictated the flow of history itself. Constantinople was not merely a strategic location, it was the hinge of the world. For over 1,000 years, its fate was the single greatest question in Eurasian politics, and the answer always lay in its harbor. The city sat at the precise meeting point of two continents and two seas, a land bridge from Europe to Asia, and a naval gate between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. Whoever held Constantinople controlled the shortest, richest trade route between the markets of the East and the treasuries of the West. Yet its true genius was its defensive design, centered around a unique geographical feature, the Golden Horn. This was not an open harbor, but a deep, sheltered inlet shaped like a curved horn, protected by a massive chain that could be stretched across its mouth to seal it from enemy fleets. Within this aquatic fortress, the merchant galleys of Venice, Genoa, and a dozen other nations could dock in perfect safety, turning the city into the greatest commercial exchange on earth. Its markets overflowed with silks from China, spices from India, furs from Russia, and gold from Africa. The city's wealth was legendary, but its port was its lifeline and its lock. This made the Golden Horn the ultimate prize in a millennia-long siege. Every empire that rose in the region understood that to claim true dominance, they must possess that harbor. The Roman Emperor Constantine founded the city there for this reason. Later, when Western European knights launched the Crusades, their stated goal was to reach Jerusalem, but their critical, often unspoken, objective was to secure the sea lanes to Constantinople, the supply route that made their campaigns possible. The Venetian-led Fourth Crusade infamously sacked the city in 1204, not for religious fervor, but to eliminate a commercial rival and control the port. For centuries, the Byzantine Empire survived not through the strength of its armies, but through the impregnability of its harbor walls and the gold that flowed into them. This all changed with the rise of a new power that understood port warfare on a grander scale. The Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, when he laid his final siege to Constantinople in 1453, knew that breaching the legendary land walls was only half the battle. To truly conquer the city, he had to break its maritime heart. In one of the most audacious military maneuvers in history, he ordered his engineers to transport an entire fleet of warships overland, using greased logs and thousands of men to bypass the Great Chain and launch them directly into the Golden Horn from behind. This masterstroke cut the city's supply lines and shattered its defenders' morale. The fall of Constantinople was not just the end of an empire, it was the moment the world's most valuable port changed hands, redirecting the currents of global trade and power for the next 500 years. Renamed Istanbul, the city and its golden harbor became the capital of the Ottoman Empire, a Muslim power that now commanded the crossroads of Christendom and the spice routes alike. Its fate reminds us that while many ports influenced politics, only one could decide for centuries who held the key to the entire map. The Golden Horn decided the fate of empires, but another harbor, far smaller and less glamorous, held a kingdom hostage to a single strip of coastline. For over 2 centuries, the English crown's most valuable possession was not an island, but a fortified port town on the continent, Calais. Possessing it was like holding the only key to a locked door, a door that opened onto England's wealth, power, and very identity. This was not a commercial hub in the Venetian style, but a political military port, a dagger pointed at the heart of France and a lifeline for the English economy. Its value stemmed from a single, humble commodity, wool. England's rolling pastures produced the finest wool in Europe, the raw material for the wealthy cloth industries of Flanders and beyond. This trade was the Crown's primary source of revenue, funding everything from royal households to armies. But to get that wool to market, it had to cross the English Channel, and the shortest, most secure route terminated at Calais. The town became a colossal customs house. Every sack of wool, every bolt of unfinished cloth had to pass through its gates, where royal officials collected substantial export duties. The money flowing from the Calais staple was so reliable it functioned as the national treasury, making the port's security a matter of economic survival. Beyond its financial role, Calais was a permanent military bridgehead. It allowed England to project power onto the continent without the perilous gamble of a seaborne invasion for every campaign. An English army could gather safely behind Calais' formidable walls, a standing threat that forced France to divert vast resources to its northern border for generations. This tiny enclave, a piece of England planted in foreign soil, became a powerful symbol of the kingdom's historic claim to continental power, a living reminder of the Plantagenet Empire that once stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees. Losing it was therefore unthinkable, which made its eventual fall a profound national trauma. After a siege in 1558, the starving garrison surrendered. The loss was framed not as a military setback but as a catastrophic amputation. Queen Mary reportedly said the word Calais would be found engraved on her heart after her passing. The event marked the painful end of England's medieval identity as a European land power, forcing a reluctant reorientation toward the sea and ultimately a new kind of global destiny. The story of Calais proves that a port's true power can be symbolic, a piece of geography that holds the mirror to a nation's deepest ambitions and its most haunting fears. A king in his palace received news by courier, a slow and filtered trickle of information. But in the port, the world arrived with every tide. The true power of these harbors lay not just in what they shipped, but in what they heard. They were the ears of the world, vast, open intelligence hubs where rumor and report were traded as actively as any spice. The constant, churning arrival of ships meant a constant, churning arrival of people, each carrying stories from distant shores. A Genoese captain just in from Alexandria might share whispers of political unrest in the Mamluk court over a tankard of ale. A Hanseatic merchant back from Novgorod could describe the severity of the Russian winter and its impact on the fur supply. A Portuguese sailor surviving the voyage from the Indies might recount a new competitor's ship sighted off the Malabar coast. This raw, unfiltered data flowed first into the taverns, guild halls, and counting houses along the waterfront, long before any formal dispatch could reach a distant throne. This gave the merchant elites who lived in this constant stream of gossip an almost prophetic advantage. While a monarch's advisors debated outdated reports, a banker in Antwerp or a ship owner in Venice was already acting on tomorrow's news. They could anticipate a poor harvest in the Baltic and buy up grain futures, creating a profitable shortage. They could hear of a peace treaty being negotiated and sell off their shares in a privateering venture before the official announcement crashed its value. This control over information was a form of soft power that rivaled any army. A merchant family with a network of correspondents could see a crisis unfolding, a dynastic dispute, a plague outbreak, a naval defeat, weeks before the sovereign whose kingdom was at stake. This allowed them to make monumental decisions, to call in loans to a suddenly risky crown, to redirect their entire fleet to a safer route, or to offer a timely loan to a desperate ruler at exorbitant rates, knowing full well why he was desperate. The relationship between port intelligence and royal power was a delicate, often deceptive dance. Merchant advisors were frequently summoned to court precisely for their superior knowledge of foreign lands and markets. A king planning a military campaign needed to know about the economic health of his enemy, the loyalty of potential allies, and the state of supply lines, all information best gathered from commercial networks. Yet this reliance created a vulnerability. The merchant's primary loyalty was to his trade and his capital, not to the crown's glory. It was not unheard of for a port financier to subtly mislead a monarch, perhaps downplaying the strength of a rival to encourage a risky war that would generate demand for loans and military supplies, or conversely, overstating a threat to discourage a conflict that might disrupt a lucrative trade route. The port, therefore, served as a lens focusing the light of global information, but the merchant who held that lens could choose what the king saw and when he saw it. In an age without satellites or instant communication, the harbor's chatter was the closest thing to a real-time news feed, and those who mastered its language held the keys to foresight, fortune, and a hidden form of governance built on whispers from the sea. The whispers of the port created a new kind of sovereign. From the teeming docks and counting houses arose figures whose power was not inherited through bloodlines, but amassed through ledgers. They were the merchant princes, and their realm was the entire known world. In an age still dominated by armored knights and crowned heads, these men operated a parallel system of influence built on credit, commodities, and connections. They proved that a fortune, if it was vast enough and fluid enough, could purchase not just luxury, but a decisive role in the highest affairs of state. Two names stand as perfect archetypes of this phenomenon, one rooted in the Mediterranean and the other at the crossroads of Europe. In France, Jacques Coeur rose from a modest merchant family to become the financier to a king. His fortune was built on a simple, brilliant insight. He established a direct trade network, bypassing the Italian middlemen, to bring the luxuries of the Levant silks, spices, and alum directly into French ports like Montpellier. This made him staggeringly wealthy, but his true power came when King Charles VII, depleted and desperate after the 100 Years' War, turned to him. Coeur essentially became the royal banker, funding the reconstruction of the French state, its armies, and its economy. He did not just lend money, he managed it, acting as the king's paymaster and commercial agent. This granted him an informal ministerial role, allowing him to negotiate treaties and influence foreign policy based on commercial, rather than purely dynastic, interests. His palace in Bruges rivaled that of any duke, a stone declaration that the source of authority had shifted. Meanwhile, in the German city of Augsburg, a family dynasty achieved a scale of financial influence that bordered on the mythical. The Fuggers were bankers, but their connection to the port of Antwerp and the silver mines of Central Europe made them the engine of continental politics. They perfected the art of financing sovereignty. Their most famous client was the Habsburg family. When Charles V needed vast sums to secure his election as Holy Roman Emperor, a process that involved literally bribing the prince-electors, it was Jacob Fugger who provided the loan. The now legendary letter Fugger sent to Charles laid bare the new reality. He reminded the emperor in stark terms that it was Fugger money, not divine right, that had placed the crown on his head. This was not subservience, it was partnership with a silent senior partner. The Fuggers' network allowed them to act as shadow diplomats, their couriers carrying financial terms faster than royal ambassadors could carry declarations. They could ransom kings from captivity by transferring funds across borders in hours. They even influenced papal elections, providing the credit that allowed cardinals to maneuver and gather support. Their power was entirely transnational, a private web stretched over the map of Europe, loyal only to the health of their own commercial empire. This created a profound tension with the old aristocracy. A duke's power was local, rooted in land and feudal oaths. A fugger's power was everywhere and nowhere, based on promises written on paper and trust between correspondents. The merchant prince could destabilize a kingdom by calling in its debts, or stabilize an empire by opening his coffers. They were the ultimate product of the port's hidden ecosystem, living proof that in the new world being born, the most potent crown might be woven from gold thread and worn not on a head but in a vault. But the merchant princes and their ledgers could not control every ship on every sea. For every lawful cargo moving between sanctioned ports, there sailed another vessel operating in the shadows, its loyalty pledged not to a king or a company, but to the highest bidder or its own ruthless code. Piracy and its state-sanctioned cousin, privateering, formed the dark undercurrent of maritime power, and the ports that harbored them became accidental capitals of chaos, wielding a destructive influence that could bring empires to the negotiating table. These were not lawless hideouts in remote coves, but sophisticated, semi-independent city-states whose entire economies were built on the systematic disruption of global trade. On the Barbary coast, ports like Algiers and Tunis operated as formidable corsair republics. Supported by local rulers, they sent out fast, agile fleets to raid Christian shipping across the Mediterranean and even into the Atlantic. Their primary objective was not mere plunder but captives who were held for ransom or sold into servitude. The scale of this operation was staggering, creating a constant climate of fear that reshaped commerce, insurance rates, and coastal life for centuries. European maritime states found themselves forced into a grim diplomacy, signing treaties and paying annual tributes to these ports simply to secure safe passage for their merchant fleets. In this way, a pirate haven like Algiers exercised a form of coercive statecraft. Its power derived entirely from its ability to inflict economic pain. Similarly, in the English Channel, the port of Dunkirk became infamous as a nest for privateers, particularly during the conflicts between Spain and the Dutch Republic. Privateering was piracy with a license authorized by a letter of marque from a government. Dunkirk's captains, flying the Spanish flag, specialized in preying on Dutch merchantmen, the lifeblood of the burgeoning Dutch economy. Each captured ship brought wealth into Dunkirk, fueling its growth and making it a persistent thorn in the side of the Netherlands. The Dutch response was not just military but financial, requiring massive investments in convoy systems and naval patrols. This dynamic elevated Dunkirk from a minor fishing port to a strategic pawn in the great power struggle, its very existence a tool used by Spain to pressure its rebellious provinces. Across the Atlantic, in the Caribbean, the English settlement of Port Royal in Jamaica became the notorious hub for buccaneers. This was a port built by piracy. It offered a safe harbor, a ready market for plundered goods, and a connection to the broader Atlantic economy. The wealth that flooded into its taverns and warehouses was so immense it earned the town a reputation as the richest and wickedest port in the world. While the English crown officially frowned upon such lawlessness, it quietly tolerated the buccaneers because they served a vital purpose, harassing Spanish shipping and settlements, thereby weakening England's primary colonial rival without requiring direct state expenditure. Port Royal, therefore, functioned as an unofficial, deniable instrument of English foreign policy in the New World. The political power of these shadow ports lay in their capacity to create leverage through instability. A king could ignore a pirate raid, but he could not ignore a collapse in his customs revenue or a paralysis in his vital supply lines. When losses mounted, states were compelled to engage with the very ports that hosted their tormentors. They sent ambassadors to negotiate ransoms, pay protection money, or even hire the pirates themselves as auxiliary forces in their wars. This granted the pirate ports a bizarre, inverted form of sovereignty. They were not recognized on official maps, yet they commanded the attention of foreign ministries. They minted no royal currency, yet they dictated the cost of safe passage. By holding maritime trade hostage, they forced the traditional powers of Europe to acknowledge them as players, however illegitimate. Their existence proved that a port's influence did not require a royal charter or a monopoly on silk, only a fleet willing to break the rules and a sheltered harbor willing to look the other way. In the grand chessboard of geopolitics, they were the rogue knights, moving unpredictably and capable of checkmating plans far grander than their own. The pirate port was a kingdom of exception, a lawless zone carved out by force, but a far more stable and ultimately more transformative kind of exceptionalism was being written into law in the great commercial harbors. These cities did not seize autonomy through cannon fire. They negotiated for it, or had it gifted to them by sovereigns who understood that commerce thrived not under the heavy hand of a crown, but under the light, precise touch of a merchant's own rules. The result was a unique political creature, the Port City Constitution, a set of liberties that created islands of self-rule within the feudal sea of medieval Europe. At the heart of this system was the Charter, a formal document granted by a king, duke, or bishop. On the surface, it was a business incentive. A ruler, often cash-poor but land-rich, would offer extraordinary privileges to a settlement on his coastline or river mouth, hoping to transform a sleepy fishing village into a bustling source of tax revenue. But these charters did much more than lower tariffs. They were, in effect, the birth certificates of a new kind of civic power. A typical charter might grant the city the right to hold its own courts, using laws tailored to mercantile disputes rather than feudal land rights. It could exempt citizens from being tried in the lord's distant court, or from the obligation to provide soldiers for his wars. Most importantly, it often allowed the city to collect its own taxes and administer its own finances. This financial independence was the bedrock of political independence. Take the example of Lübeck, the queen of the Hanseatic League. In 1226, it received an imperial charter from Frederick II that made it a free imperial city. This meant Lübeck answered directly to the Holy Roman Emperor, not to any local duke or count. Its citizens were free men, not serfs. The city council, elected from among the wealthiest merchant families, had the authority to make laws, mint coins, and declare war. This was not a symbolic title, it was a working system of sovereignty. When Lübeck's merchants needed to negotiate a trade treaty with the rulers of Novgorod or Bruges, they did not send a petition to a distant emperor. Their city council dispatched its own ambassadors, negotiated its own terms, and enforced those agreements with its own fleet. They were conducting foreign policy in all but name, their decisions driven by balance sheets and market forecasts, not by imperial dynastic ambitions. This model replicated itself across the map. In Spain, the port of Barcelona operated under the usages, a code of customs and laws that guaranteed its citizens' personal liberty and property rights, creating a vibrant commercial culture distinct from the feudal interior of Catalonia. In Italy, the very concept of the city republic, from Venice to Genoa to Pisa, was the ultimate expression of port autonomy, where the merchant class was the government. Even within powerful kingdoms, certain ports operated as special zones. The French king granted the port of La Rochelle extensive privileges in the 12th century, allowing it to elect its own mayor and council. For centuries, La Rochelle functioned almost as a city-state within France, its loyalties swaying between the French crown and the English king, based on which power best guaranteed its commercial freedoms. This made it a pivotal and unpredictable player in the 100 Years' War, a testament to how a charter could make a port a political actor in its own right. The cumulative effect of these liberties was profound. Within the walls of these chartered ports, a different social and intellectual climate took root. The air smelled of salt and opportunity, not of feudal obligation. Success was measured in profit, not in acres of land or titles of nobility. This environment attracted not just goods, but minds, innovators, cartographers, shipwrights, and bankers. It fostered early forms of representative government, as wealthy merchants demanded a say in the laws that governed their trade. The port city became a laboratory for ideas that would later define the modern world: the rule of law over the rule of men, the power of elected councils, and the notion that civic identity could be based on commerce and citizenship rather than birth and bondage. Their charters were more than legal documents. They were declarations of a separate peace, treaties between commerce and crown that quietly redrew the boundaries of power, proving that sometimes the most revolutionary ideas arrived not on the point of a sword, but docked safely in a harbor, wrapped in the parchment of a trade deal. A charter could protect a merchant's goods, but what about his soul? The same ships that carried silks and spices also carried something far more volatile: ideas. The port, with its constant influx of foreign people and its arm's-length relationship with inland authority, became Europe's great incubator for religious dissent. While kings and bishops in the heartlands enforced orthodoxy with fire and sword, the waterfront often hummed with a different kind of faith. This was not a coincidence. The very nature of a port's existence fostered a climate of intellectual risk. Sailors and merchants returning from Alexandria, Constantinople, or Baltic shores brought back not just cargo, but stories of different rituals, different interpretations, different ways of seeing the divine. In the crowded taverns and markets, these ideas mixed and spread, finding fertile ground among a population used to judging a man by his word and his worth, not by the doctrine preached in his local parish. Furthermore, the relative autonomy of many port cities created a buffer. A bishop's writ might hold power in the cathedral city 50 miles inland, but on the docks, his authority was diluted by the immediate, practical demands of commerce and the cosmopolitan crowd. This distance from central control offered a precarious but real space for new beliefs to take root. We see this pattern early with movements like the Cathars in southern France. Their strongholds were not just in remote castles, but in thriving Mediterranean ports like Toulouse and Albi, cities deeply connected to trade routes that stretched to the Middle East and the Balkans, where similar dualist beliefs were circulating. The flow of goods facilitated the flow of theology. Centuries later, as the Protestant Reformation shattered the unity of Western Christendom, ports again became its most enthusiastic amplifiers. Antwerp, that financial powerhouse, rapidly became a hotbed of Lutheran and then Calvinist thought. Printed pamphlets and vernacular Bibles, the social media of the 16th century, arrived in bales alongside English wool and Portuguese pepper. They were disseminated through the same efficient networks that moved merchandise, discussed in the same exchanges where deals were struck. The city's magistrates, often merchants themselves and more concerned with keeping trade flowing than with enforcing religious conformity, were initially hesitant to crack down. This allowed Protestant congregations to form in the shadow of the cathedral, transforming religious dissent into a powerful political force. When the Habsburg authorities finally tried to impose Catholic orthodoxy, it was not just a matter of faith, it was an assault on the city's hard-won liberties and the social order of its merchant elite. The resulting rebellion was as much about civic autonomy and economic self-determination as it was about scripture. Similarly, in London, the Thames was a river of ideas. Protestant texts smuggled from Antwerp and Rotterdam entered through the wharves of the Steelyard, the Hanseatic trading post, and circulated among apprentices, shipwrights, and merchants. The city's growing Protestant sentiment, nurtured in its portside parishes, became a critical factor in the English Reformation. pushing the crown toward a more decisive break with Rome. In port cities, religious ferment was never purely spiritual, it was civic. To challenge the universal church was to challenge a pillar of the old feudal order, an order that often restricted the very commercial freedoms these cities cherished. Embracing a new faith could be an act of political and economic self-definition, a declaration of independence from distant powers, both papal and royal. The harbor, therefore, was where heresy learned to speak the language of rebellion, proving that the most dangerous cargo was sometimes unloaded not in a crate but in a conversation. The whispers of heresy and rebellion were carried on the same winds that now filled the sails of a new kind of ship, one bound not for the Mediterranean or the Baltic, but for the vast, open Atlantic. The center of gravity for port power was shifting westward, pulled by a commodity that would reshape the world: sweetness. Sugar began as a rare luxury, a medicine and a spice from the East, but by the 17th century it had become a necessity, craved by everyone from London dockworkers to Parisian aristocrats. The ports that mastered its production and distribution did not just grow wealthy, they became the financial engines for entire empires, their influence rooted in a system of staggering scale and profound human cost. This was the birth of the plantation economy, and its command centers were the sugar ports. Lisbon and Seville were the first to taste this new power. As the Portuguese and Spanish carved out island colonies in the Atlantic, like Madeira, the Canaries, and later São Tomé, they established the prototype. They cleared land, planted cane, and built mills, creating the first link in a brutal but immensely profitable chain. The sugar was processed on these islands and shipped back to the home ports, where it was refined and sold across Europe. The profits were so immense they funded further exploration and conquest, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of expansion. But these early island plantations faced a relentless problem: a shortage of labor. The solution, tragically, would come from the coast of West Africa, initiating a forced migration of millions. This transformed the Atlantic into a triangular highway of commerce and suffering, and it was in ports like Bristol in England and Nantes in France where the financial machinery of this system was perfected. These cities did not just handle sugar, they managed the entire interconnected enterprise. Shipyards built the specialized vessels for the Middle Passage, the leg of the journey from Africa to the Americas. Banks and merchant houses financed the voyages, spreading the risk among investors through shares in a single ship. Warehouses along the Avon River in Bristol or the Loire in Nantes stored the raw sugar and molasses arriving from Barbados or Saint Domingue, while refineries with towering chimneys processed it into white gold. The wealth generated was almost incomprehensible. A single successful voyage could make a merchant's fortune, and the continuous flow built family dynasties whose grand mansions, funded by sugar, still stand in these cities today. This concentrated capital did more than create personal riches, it altered the balance of power between European states. The taxes on sugar imports filled royal treasuries, funding navies and armies. More subtly, it created a powerful new political class, the West India interest, a lobby of plantation owners, ship captains, refiners, and bankers. These men, with their fortunes directly tied to the plantation system, became relentless advocates in the halls of Parliament and the court of Versailles. They pushed for naval protection for their convoys, for wars to seize rival sugar islands, and for laws that protected their supply of labor and their market dominance. Their influence was direct and potent. The series of 18th century wars between Britain and France were, in many ways, wars for sugar. A map of Caribbean islands changed hands with each treaty, not for strategic military value, but for the productive capacity of their soil. The decision to send a fleet to the West Indies was often a response to the urgent petitions of this wealthy, well-connected lobby. In this way, the sugar ports exercised a remote control over imperial policy. The priorities of a plantation owner in Jamaica, transmitted through his merchant agent in Bristol, could dictate where the British Royal Navy sailed and where soldiers fought. The port was the nexus where colonial profit was converted into metropolitan power, proving that the most potent political lever might be the simple, universal craving for something sweet. Sugar built fortunes, but a fleet required a forest. The true measure of a maritime power lay not in the gold in its treasury, but in the raw materials in its shipyards. For any nation dreaming of ruling the waves, there existed a brutal, inescapable dependency. They could not build a single warship without the towering pines of the Baltic, the sticky tar of Scandinavia, and the tough hemp of Russia. These were the naval stores, the unglamorous essentials that kept a wooden navy afloat and fighting, and the ports that controlled their supply held the ultimate strategic leverage over every would-be sea empire. Consider the anatomy of a great ship of the line. Its massive hull required thousands of tons of specific timber, straight, strong, and resilient. Only the slow-grown pine and oak from the cold forests of Sweden, Poland, and Livonia possessed the right qualities. Its rigging and sails demanded miles of rope, crafted from hemp fibers that could withstand the brutal chafe of wind and saltwater, a crop Russia mastered. And to make the vessel watertight, every seam between planks had to be caulked with oakum and sealed with tar, a pungent, viscous substance distilled from the pine trees of Sweden and Finland. Without these three components, a fleet was just an idea. A port like London or Amsterdam might have the wealth, the skilled shipwrights, and the grand ambitions, but it lacked the trees. This created a profound vulnerability. England, an island nation whose security and identity were increasingly tied to its navy, was utterly reliant on imports for its very survival. The Netherlands, whose wealth floated on a vast merchant fleet, faced the same precarious reality. They could be starved of naval power at its source. Consequently, the political alignment of a handful of Baltic ports became a matter of the highest national security. Who controlled the export hubs of Riga, Stockholm, or Danzig? Was the Swedish king friendly to Dutch interests, or was he negotiating a secret deal with France? Would the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth grant favorable trading privileges to English merchants, or would they impose a prohibitive tariff? These were not mere commercial questions, they were existential ones. A hostile power gaining control over these ports could impose an embargo, instantly crippling the shipbuilding capacity of its rivals. The entire foreign policy of maritime states like England and the Dutch Republic was for centuries shaped by this single, overriding need. Alliances were formed, wars were threatened, and diplomats were dispatched with one primary goal: to secure the flow of naval stores. This dependency gave the Baltic port cities and their hinterlands an outsized, quiet form of power. They did not need to build grand navies of their own. Their leverage was passive, rooted in the very geography of their forests and fields. A Swedish monarch could use the promise of timber contracts as a diplomatic tool, enticing a powerful navy like England's to support his political aims in Northern Europe. The merchants of Riga, knowing their hemp was irreplaceable, could negotiate from a position of immense strength, demanding favorable terms for their grain and fur in exchange. The entire region became a strategic chessboard where moves were calculated not just in territory, but in future shipbuilding capacity. It created a strange paradox. The greatest global naval powers of the age were held in check by kingdoms and ports that often possessed only modest fleets themselves. Their strength was not projected across oceans, but embedded in the soil and the sap of their trees, a reminder that sometimes the deepest form of control is held not by those who build the ships, but by those who grow the bones from which those ships are made. Yet the Dutch did not simply defend their harbors, they weaponized them. Their rebellion against the mighty Spanish Empire became the ultimate demonstration of port power in action, a war where ideology was funded by ledgers and fought on waterways. The Dutch revolt was not a traditional peasant uprising or a dynastic squabble. It was a maritime insurgency, sustained by the immense wealth and naval ingenuity of cities like Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and the ports of Zeeland. When the Spanish crown under Philip II attempted to impose Catholic orthodoxy and crush local privileges, the response from these commercial hubs was not just defiance, it was a calculated financial and naval counteroffensive. The ports had the resources that the inland provinces lacked, a deep reservoir of capital and a mastery of the sea. Amsterdam's merchant elite, many of them sympathetic to the Protestant cause, did not just offer prayers, they offered loans. They financed the rebel armies of William of Orange, paying for mercenaries, weapons, and fortifications. This private wealth, pooled from trade in Baltic grain, North Sea herring, and Atlantic textiles, effectively bankrolled a new state. But money alone could not stop the formidable Spanish tercios, the best infantry in Europe. The port's true strategic genius lay in their geography and their ships. The rebel heartland was a landscape of rivers, estuaries, and flooded polders, a watery maze where the Dutch were the undisputed masters. They used their shallow draft vessels, designed for coastal and river trade, as nimble warships. These sea beggars, as they were called, operated from their port bases to raid Spanish supply convoys, blockade loyalist cities, and seize control of vital river traffic. They turned the Netherlands' greatest vulnerability, its low-lying geography, into an impregnable fortress. A Spanish army, no matter how well trained, was helpless if it could not be fed or paid. The beggars systematically choked off the Spanish lifeline, intercepting shipments of silver and grain meant for the troops. This economic strangulation was as decisive as any battlefield victory. Furthermore, the ports provided a sanctuary and a gateway. When Spanish forces recaptured the great inland commercial city of Antwerp in 1585, it was a crushing blow. But the rebellion did not collapse. Instead, its financial and naval core simply shifted north to Amsterdam. Protestant merchants, craftsmen, and capital fled Antwerp and flooded into Amsterdam, bringing with them their expertise, their trade networks, and their liquid wealth. This influx supercharged the Dutch port, transforming it almost overnight into the new commercial capital of Northern Europe. Amsterdam then used this consolidated power to escalate the conflict on a global scale. It funded and launched direct attacks on the Spanish Empire overseas, striking at its treasure fleets and colonial outposts, forcing Spain to fight a draining war on two fronts. In essence, the Dutch ports did not just support the rebellion, they became the rebellion. Their ability to generate wealth, control the aquatic battlefield, and project power across oceans created a sustainable engine for independence that mere land-based resistance could never have achieved. The Dutch Republic that emerged was at its heart a confederation of port cities, a nation whose sovereignty was literally dredged from the sea and defended by the shrewd calculus of its merchants. It proved that the most successful revolution could be one where the war chest was a counting house and the most loyal soldier was a ship's captain. Amsterdam did not just win a war, it built a new world. In the 17th century, this port on the Amstel River became something unprecedented, a warehouse for the entire planet. It inherited the financial sophistication of Antwerp and the mercantile ambition of Venice, then fused them into a system of such efficiency and scale that it quietly governed the emerging global economy. The city's power was no longer about controlling a single trade route or commodity, but about controlling the very mechanisms of trade itself. At its heart were three revolutionary innovations that turned commerce into a science. First was the Amsterdam Exchange Bank, founded in 1609. This was not a lending house for the wealthy, but a public utility designed to solve a fundamental problem: the chaotic jumble of hundreds of different coins from across Europe circulating in the port. The bank allowed merchants to deposit any currency, have its value assessed and recorded in a stable, reliable ledger, and then make payments to other account holders with a simple written transfer. This created a trusted, uniform standard of value, a proto-currency that made Amsterdam the safest and most predictable place in Europe to do business. It was the world's first central bank in all but name, and it drew capital to the city like a magnet. The second innovation was an organization of staggering ambition, the Dutch East India Company, known by its initials VOC. This was not just a trading company, it was a sovereign corporation. The States General of the Netherlands granted it a monopoly on trade east of the Cape of Good Hope, but also the power to wage war, negotiate treaties, establish colonies, and coin money. It was, in effect, a privatized empire with its own army and navy, funded by shares sold to the public. The VOC's headquarters in Amsterdam became the command center for a vast commercial network stretching from the Spice Islands of Indonesia to the ports of Japan. Its fleets returned laden with pepper, cloves, nutmeg, porcelain, and silk, but the real treasure was the information flowing back into the company's meticulous archives, giving Amsterdam an unparalleled intelligence advantage over every rival. The third, and perhaps most transformative, innovation emerged from the bustling square outside the VOC's doors, the Amsterdam Stock Exchange. Here, the trading of company shares became a public spectacle, but the true genius was the development of a market for futures. A merchant could now buy or sell a contract for a shipment of Baltic grain or Norwegian timber that had not even been harvested yet, or for a cargo of spices still growing on a Malaccan island. This abstract trade in promises allowed merchants to hedge against risk, lock in prices, and speculate on future events, separating the concept of value from the physical goods themselves. Finance became a commodity. This powerful trinity, the stable bank, the sovereign company, and the speculative exchange, concentrated in one port city, created a self-reinforcing cycle of dominance. Capital flowed to Amsterdam because it was safe, information was best there because all trade passed through, and all trade passed through because the capital and information were already there. The city's warehouses overflowed with goods from every continent, but its real product was confidence. Prices for goods in London, Lisbon, and Gdansk were set by the trading on the Amsterdam Exchange. Kings and emperors found their economic policies constrained by the reactions of Dutch financiers. When a harvest failed in Poland, it was Amsterdam's futures market that determined how much bread would cost in Paris. The port became the central processing unit of early modern capitalism, its canals acting as data cables through which the wealth of the world was sorted, priced, and redirected. Amsterdam proved that the ultimate port power was not merely to be a hub of trade, but to become the brain of the market itself, a place where numbers on a page could dictate the fate of nations far from the sea. Amsterdam's financial brain was a marvel, but it was not invincible. The very system it perfected would eventually draw the attention of a new kind of rival, one that could not be outmaneuvered on the exchange floor. The age of the sovereign port city, the merchant republic, and the autonomous league was slowly closing. A countervailing force was consolidating inland, in the palaces and chancelleries of powerful, centralized territorial states. Nations like France, England, and Spain began to look upon the immense wealth of their own ports not as a source of civic pride, but as a reservoir of national power that was being siphoned off by private interests. They launched a deliberate, centuries-long project to capture that wealth for the crown, a political and economic doctrine we now call mercantilism. This was not a subtle shift, it was a fundamental reordering of the world. The state declared that the purpose of commerce was no longer the enrichment of merchant families or city councils, but the strengthening of the nation as a whole, measured in the accumulation of precious metals and the defeat of foreign rivals. To achieve this, kings built the tools of central control, They invested in royal navies, vast fleets that belonged to the state, not to a trading company or a city's admiralty. These navies existed to protect national trade, yes, but also to enforce the king's will upon his own ports and to challenge the maritime dominance of places like Amsterdam. Alongside the ships came the bureaucrats, a new class of royal officials whose job was to standardize, regulate, and tax. They imposed uniform weights and measures, established national customs services to collect duties at every harbor, and wrote maritime codes that applied to all subjects of the crown, overriding the unique charters of individual cities. The most potent weapon, however, was economic policy itself. Mercantilist states enacted a web of laws designed to funnel all colonial trade through the mother country's ports in a closed loop. The English Navigation Acts, passed in the 1650s, are the classic example. They stipulated that goods from Asia, Africa, or the Americas could only be imported into England or its colonies on English-owned ships with English-majority crews. Furthermore, valuable colonial products like sugar, tobacco, and later cotton had to be shipped first to an English port before they could be re-exported elsewhere. This was a direct assault on the Dutch model of open carrying trade. Overnight, Amsterdam's role as the universal warehouse was challenged by law. The purpose was clear: to ensure that the profits from every stage of the process, from shipping to insurance to brokerage, accrued to English subjects and filled the English treasury. The effect on once autonomous ports was profound. A city like Bristol, which had thrived on its own privateer traditions and independent networks, now found its ships conscripted into royal convoys and its merchants forced to comply with London's complex regulations. The port's prosperity was still encouraged, but its political independence was steadily eroded. Its destiny was now tied to the national project. The state's growing financial power, drawn from this systematized trade, also allowed it to outmuscle the old merchant princes. When a king could raise taxes from a whole kingdom or secure a massive loan from a national bank, he no longer needed to beg for funds from a single wealthy family like the Fuggers or a city council like Lübeck's. The relationship flipped. Now it was the port cities that needed the crown for naval protection, for diplomatic support in trade disputes, and for the legal framework that governed their increasingly global operations. This long, uneven struggle between port sovereignty and territorial consolidation reshaped the map of power. The Hanseatic League gradually faded, its privileges revoked by stronger Scandinavian and German princes. The Italian city-states, though culturally brilliant, became political pawns fought over by the French and Spanish monarchies. Even the mighty Dutch Republic, a federation of ports, found itself in a perpetual arms race against the larger, more populous kingdoms of England and France, a contest that would eventually exhaust its resources. The age of the port as a standalone political actor was waning, not with a dramatic siege, but through the slow, relentless pressure of paperwork, tariffs, and the broadside of a royal warship flying a national flag. The harbors still thrived, but the decisions that moved the world were increasingly made in inland capitals, by ministers who saw the sea not as a realm of freedom, but as another frontier to be claimed in the name of the state. The logic of the choke point did not fade with the age of sail. It simply found new harbors. Centuries after Venetian galleys patrolled the Adriatic, the same strategic principle was being etched onto the global map by emerging industrial empires, now armed with steel and steam. They understood that a single fortified port, planted at the right geographical pinch point, could command the movement of entire navies and economies. Two names stand as perfect modern heirs to this ancient idea: Gibraltar and Singapore, stone sentinels guarding the gates of continents. Gibraltar is a sheer limestone rock, a geological afterthought clinging to the southern tip of Spain. But its value lies not in its size but in its position. It stands sentinel over the Strait of Gibraltar, the only maritime gateway between the vast Atlantic Ocean and the enclosed Mediterranean Sea. For a seafaring power like Britain, which seized it in the early 18th century, controlling this rock was like holding the only key to a locked inner sea. The Royal Navy fortified it with miles of tunnels, gun emplacements, and a deep water port. From this fortress, Britain could monitor, and if necessary, strangle, the naval movements of any rival in the Mediterranean, protecting its lifeline to India and the East. It was a sovereign piece of Britain planted on foreign soil, a permanent aircraft carrier before the concept existed. Its power derived solely from its location at a bottleneck. On the opposite side of the world, a similar calculation created another fortress port. Singapore was not a natural stronghold, but a deliberate choice. In the early 19th century, Sir Stamford Raffles of the British East India Company identified a sparsely inhabited island at the tip of the Malay Peninsula. He saw what medieval merchants would have seen instantly, a perfect choke point. The island commanded the Strait of Malacca, the narrow, vital sea lane connecting the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea and the lucrative markets of East Asia. Nearly all trade between Europe and China, or the Spice Islands of Indonesia, had to pass this way. Britain transformed Singapore into a colossal naval base and a free port, attracting trade from all over Asia. Its docks and fortifications ensured that Britain controlled the eastern door of the Indian Ocean, just as Gibraltar controlled the western door of the Mediterranean. The strategy was breathtakingly simple and identical to that of the Portuguese Feitorias centuries before. Own the door and you own the traffic. The influence wielded by these two ports was utterly disproportionate to their tiny footprints. They were not centers of production or vast consumer markets. Their power was purely positional, a geometric form of sovereignty. In times of peace, they served as vital coaling stations and commercial hubs, their neutrality enforced by the guns of the empire that held them. In times of war, they became unbreakable locks. A hostile power in control of Gibraltar could trap the British Mediterranean fleet, severing a critical artery of empire. Controlling Singapore meant controlling the flow of oil, rubber, and troops to the entire Pacific theater. These were not just ports, they were global switches, and the hand on the switch resided in London. Their stories, from their founding to their dramatic sieges in the 20th century, are the final, powerful chapters in the medieval playbook. They prove that while the ships changed from wood to iron, and the cargo from spice to oil, the fundamental calculus of power remained anchored in geography. The enduring lesson of Gibraltar and Singapore is that in a connected world, true control often lies not in occupying vast territories, but in possessing the precise points where all the lines on the map converge. The story of these ports is not a collection of random successes, but a recurring playbook of hidden control. From Venice to Amsterdam, from Genoa to Singapore, the same fundamental tools were used again and again to quietly steer the course of history. The first and most direct was monopoly control. Whether it was Venetian spices, Portuguese pepper, or Dutch shares in the East India Company, power flowed from controlling something the world could not do without. By becoming the sole or primary source of a vital luxury or necessity, a port could make kings and consumers alike bend to its terms. This economic stranglehold was almost always reinforced by the second tool, financial leverage. The Genoese did not just sell goods, they sold credit. They mastered the art of turning debt into dominion, funding the ambitions of empires only to hold the strings of those very ambitions. A port that could bankroll a war could also decide its outcome, making the ledger a more potent weapon than the lance. But money and monopolies required information to be effective, which leads to the third mechanism, intelligence superiority. Ports were the world's nervous system. The first news of a harvest failure, a political coup, or a shipwreck arrived on the docks, giving merchant elites a foresight that royal courts could only dream of. This allowed them to anticipate crises, manipulate markets, and offer strategically timed loans, always staying several moves ahead on the global chessboard. This advantage was magnified by the fourth pattern, network effects. Power was not just in a single city, but in the web it spun. The Hanseatic League was a network of cities, the Fugger Bank was a network of correspondents, and the sugar trade was a network of planters, shippers, and refiners. This distributed structure made them resilient, adaptable, and impossible to defeat by striking a single capital. Loyalty to the network often outweighed loyalty to any crown, creating a borderless form of sovereignty. Finally, underpinning it all was the timeless strategy of the choke point. From the Øresund Sound to the Strait of Malacca, the most enduring power often came from simply owning the door. Controlling a critical passage meant you did not need to produce the wealth of the world. You only needed to tax it, regulate it, or block it as it passed by your cannons. This geometric form of influence proved that sometimes the smallest point on the map could hold the greatest leverage. While individual ports rose to dazzling heights and eventually faded, these five mechanisms remained the constant engines of their secret rule. They remind us that political power has always had a silent partner, one that speaks the language of cargo, credit, and current, waiting for the next tide to turn. The legacy of these ports is written not in marble, but in the very architecture of our world. For centuries, the clandestine engines of medieval and early modern politics were not found in throne rooms, but on wharves, in warehouses, and within the pages of merchant ledgers. This history reveals a fundamental truth: economics and statecraft were inseparable, two currents flowing through the same harbor. Kings might declare wars, but ports decided if they could be funded. Empires drew borders on maps, but trade routes drawn by merchant ships defined the true borders of influence and power. To understand the past, then, we must train our eyes to look beyond the obvious stages of palaces and battlefields. We must learn to see the quiet mechanics at work in the counting houses, to hear the political negotiations disguised as haggling over pepper prices, and to recognize the sovereign power embedded in a ship's manifest or a banker's letter of credit. The real plot of history was often advanced by men who thought in profit margins and nautical charts, their decisions quietly steering the destinies of nations. That legacy is all around us. Our modern globalized world, with its interconnected supply chains, financial markets, and digital networks, is the direct descendant of those early port-based systems. The trade winds that filled the sails of Venetian galleys now carry data packets across fiber optic cables, but the principle remains: control over the flow of value, whether it be spice or information, grants a form of sovereignty. The story of these hidden capitals reminds us that power is fluid, often residing in the connectors rather than the centers. If you found this journey into history's hidden mechanics compelling and want to explore more of the unseen forces that have shaped our world, be sure to subscribe. Our next exploration is already waiting just beyond the horizon.